And thank you all for joining us for the Supporting Students at Times of Crisis webinar. My name is Jessica Brinkley, and I will be the moderator for this evening's webinar. This presentation is brought to you by the NEA Center for Great Public Schools ESP Quality Department in collaboration with Dr. David Schonfeld. The ESP Quality Department represents and advocates for the nearly 500,000 NEA education support professional members, also referred to as ESP. Our strategic focus is to elevate ESP careers by developing, implementing, and promoting best practices and policies that enhance ESP effectiveness in meeting the needs of the whole student. We provide the tools, programs, and resources to ensure that ESP become empowered leaders, accomplished professionals, and members of a high-quality education workforce. At this time, I would like to introduce to you our presenter for this evening, Dr. David Schonfeld. Dr. David Schonfeld, MD, FAAP, Developmental Behavioral Pediatrician, and Director of the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement, located at the University of Southern California School of Social Work, is a professor of the practice in the Suzanne Dworak-Peck School of Social Work and Pediatrics at the University of Southern California and Children's Hospital in Los Angeles. He is a member of the American Academy of Pediatrics Disaster Preparedness Advisory Council and served as a commissioner for both the National Commission on Children and Disasters and the Sandy Hook Advisory Commission in Connecticut. Dr. Schonfeld has authored over 100 scholarly articles, chapter books, and other books, including The Grieving Student, a teacher's guide published by Books Publishing, and has provided over 850 presentations on the topic of pediatric bereavement and crisis. He has provided consultation and training on school crisis and pediatric bereavement in the aftermath of a number of school crisis events and disasters within the United States and abroad. It is with great pleasure that I welcome with us this evening Dr. David Schonfeld.
All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be on the call with all of you. So what I wanted to cover in this webinar was really to talk about how do you support children after a crisis event. And although I'm going to be giving examples that relate to major national disasters or school shootings that reach the media, the information that I provide is going to be relevant even if you're dealing with a student who's had a personal or family crisis. So you don't have to wait for major disaster events before you can use this information in the work that you do in schools every day. I'm going to talk some about the symptoms of adjustment reactions to help you identify children most in need. I'll talk about the timeline for adjustment to give you some sense of the course for recovery. And then I want to touch on professional self-care and to recognize the impact these events have on adults who are serving and supporting children. And then I'm going to turn to where to find some free resources for further information. In the immediate aftermath of a major crisis event, we often talk about providing psychological first aid, or PFA. And that's something that should be provided broadly to all of those who are impacted by the event. And it involves offering psychoeducation and supportive services. The goal is to foster effective and normative coping strategies and adjustment. It's really just to accelerate the natural healing process. All of the staff that are in a position to help children, not just mental health staff or classroom educators, should understand the likely reactions that they may see in children after these events and some practical steps on how to help children cope. The reality is anyone that interacts with children and their families can be a potential source of assistance and support, but if they are unprepared, particularly if they're seen as insensitive, they can also become a source of further distress. So as an example, I remember talking with one food service professional who witnessed a child going through the trash in school in the cafeteria, and on simple inquiry was able to find out that the child was actually looking for food for his family. And that's a simple observation that can make a big difference in the lives of the child and the family. I went and responded to one school that had had a major school shooting, and I was talking to various groups of staff. And one group that I was talking with were the custodians, and they told me that they were concerned that the students now seemed to be out of control. This had happened in a high school, and I asked the custodian to give me some example of what he observed as out-of-control behavior. He told me he was walking through the cafeteria one day after lunch, and he saw a group of students get up and leave their trays behind. He stopped them and reminded them that the trays were still out, but the children continued to walk away. And at that point, he just said, wait, no one is going to pick up after you. If you leave those trays, they're going to stay on the table. At which point the students went back to the table, they picked up the trays, they went to the door, and they threw them outside of the building, and then looked at the custodian and said, are you happy now? They're not on the table anymore. And the custodian looked at me and he said, you know, these are really good kids, and they would never have done this before the shooting occurred, and I'm really concerned about them. And what concerns me most, he shared with me, was that he knew that those children would never have that type of behavior in front of the principal or any of the school administrator or teachers, and most likely not in front of their parents as well. And he just looked at me and said, we see a different side of these kids, and we're really very worried. So a lot of what happens is that the individuals who are providing support, what you do every day, you're going to be the ones that really detect often when children are having difficulty and may actually be the people who are in the position to support them. Now, it's also the case that, you know, schools are remembered by not only the single act of kindness that someone provides, but often the simple act of unkindness that someone provides. So I remember when my daughter was running late to high school one day, and I ended up driving her to school, which was unusual. And as soon as I left her at the school, I realized that she had forgotten her lunch at home. So I went back to the school and I brought the lunch and met with the front office staff. And I asked them to just let her know that her lunch was there so she could come down and pick it up. And the administrative assistant just looked at me and said, you shouldn't do that. And I asked, what do you mean? And she said, well, you know, if you cater to your children this way, they're never going to learn to be responsible. And I just looked at her. I know my daughter well, and actually she's really difficult to be with if she doesn't eat, and it was really my doing something for the school staff in addition to my child. And I just said, please, just let her know it's here. And I walked out of the school thinking that, you know, maybe my daughter's right. Maybe they really aren't that caring at school. So that simple comment that was made by one support professional left me with a really bad feeling about the climate in the school. And I know that that's not really characteristic of the rest of the school, but that's what happened. So I think it's really important that educational support professionals understand how to provide psychological first aid. And so I'm going to say that, you know, one last general comment about this was I went and I did an in-service training for a school system that had had a lot of loss and crisis events. And we actually spent about 4.5 hours over 2 days just going over some of this material. And at the very end, one of the food service professionals came up to me and said, you know, I've been in this school for over 20 years, and this is the first time that I've ever been invited to a professional development day. She said, this information is relevant to me personally and professionally, and I just want to thank you for recognizing that support professionals actually provide support. So I think this is, you know, extremely relevant to you, so I want to go over what are the steps in psychological first aid, at least as described by the American Red Cross. So the first one is observation or awareness, and I'm going to address some of the common symptoms of adjustment difficulties shortly. The next one is to make a connection, help people feel comfortable and at ease, and be kind, calm, and compassionate. The reality is that people often pick up on the affective tone more than they pick up on the content when they're really in distress. In other words, they listen more to how you're speaking than what you actually say. So I remember going with someone that works with me after she found out that she had cancer, and she was going to her first appointment with her oncologist to come to that appointment along with her husband. And I sat through the session for about an hour, and I actually think that the oncologist did a very nice job of explaining both what they were concerned about as well as what they planned for the course of treatment. And as we were walking out of the session, she looked at me and she said, isn't that good news? I don't have cancer. I looked at her and I said, well, why don't you think you have cancer? You've given permission for surgery to remove the tumor. You've given permission for chemotherapy to treat the cancer. Why would you think you don't have cancer? And all she looked at me and said was, he seems so positive. And I said, yes, he's very hopeful that you will be successfully treated for your cancer, but that doesn't suggest you don't have it. So all she picked up on was the overall tone of the conversation and really wasn't able to process the information that was provided to her. So I think it's very important that when kids are in distress, and adults as well, that we make them feel comfortable and at ease and be kind, calm, and compassionate. The next step is to assist with basic needs, and I'm going to go over that on the next slide, so let's skip that for now. Then what you want to do is listen. Listen to children and try and understand not only the questions that they have, but there may be some underlying questions as well. And you want to answer those questions and give realistic reassurance, but you don't want to give false reassurance. If children tell you that they are worried, then they are worried. And we need to allow them to own their feelings. There's a tendency for us to keep telling people that they shouldn't be worried about something. But if they are worried, and they have a right to be that way. So what I would do is start by telling them the information that you know that may be more reassuring to them. But if they persist with concerns, then you go to the next step, which is to encourage good coping. Allow them to own their feelings and then help them think about how you're going to help them deal with it. There are a couple things that you can do. You can help people connect, so help them identify supports in their family and their community. I was talking to one group of bus drivers in a school, and the question came up about how can bus drivers help children who are grieving or dealing with a crisis event. And one of the bus drivers said, really there's a lot that we can do. She gave the example that she had driven a group of kids to one of the schools, and as the kids were getting off, she just asked one of the boys to stay afterward. And all she did was look at him and say, I hear that your brother died. That can be difficult for anyone to deal with. I want you to go right inside the school and talk to a counselor. Will you do that for me? And she just said that made a difference in the kid's life, and it only took part of a minute to be able to do that. So you want to help them identify supports both in their family, in the school, and in the community where they can get help. And then you also want to help them figure out how best to help others. Because people do feel better when they're in crisis situations if they feel less powerless. And there's not many ways that are better at feeling that you can do something if you're able to do something to help others. You also want to give accurate and timely information, particularly as an event is unfolding, but you don't want to give unnecessary or graphic details. There's a tendency for individuals to sometimes tell more information that's necessary. We really want children to know enough so that they feel they understand what's going on and they know what steps to take to protect themselves and others. But we don't need to give them a lot of graphic information or visual images that are not helpful to them. That's one of the reasons why we recommend reducing the amount of media coverage that children view in disaster and crisis events. You want to then suggest a referral resource, such as resources within the school as well as the community, and then end the conversation. When we're doing psychological first aid, it's something you're supposed to be able to do with someone you have not met before and be able to complete it in about 5 to 10 minutes. So it's a very brief intervention that just helps individuals figure out how to get some assistance, to connect with them, to show compassion, to help them figure out how to cope, and then to move on for you, because you're not expected to provide counseling or ongoing support in this context. Now, in addition to providing psychological first aid, it's also important to provide basic supportive services. As I'm talking to some of the healthcare providers that are dealing with the recent hurricanes, a lot of what they're doing is making sure that people have clean drinking water, formula, and food for their infants and children, and a place to stay that's safe and dry. And it underscores that really what you need to do is to provide for people's basic services and basic needs first. I was once in a planning meeting with a large healthcare system where they were thinking about how they would plan for decontamination after a chemical terrorist attack. So, after they went through the scenario, someone asked me, well, what should we do about finding out what behavioral health services or mental health services these individuals would need? So I said, well, let's think about the scenario. You have 500 people attending an athletic event. And during that event, they are informed that although they can't see or smell it, they have been exposed to a chemical terrorist agent that might kill them or those they care about who are with them. And at that point, all of their clothing is removed and everything that they have on their body. And it is not returned. I mean, to be quite honest, if you are exposed to sarin, they don't wipe that off of your cell phone and hand your cell phone back. Whatever you have on your person is removed probably permanently, but at least for a long period of time. So at that point, they would be standing there naked, scared, afraid of dying. They wouldn't have any clothing. They'd be dripping wet. They wouldn't have their wallets, money, identification, driver's license, cell phones, car, home keys, cash, etc. They have no way to get home, no way to contact those that they care about, no means of transportation or communication, and they don't have the ability to purchase food or obtain shelter. So when people then said to me, what do these people need in terms of mental health services, I told them that I knew what they needed and that I didn't really even have to ask them. And, I found that I was working in a lot of disaster situations and often at meetings at a national level, and it tended to be that people talked in acronyms. I don't actually like acronyms, but I decided in order to fit in and to seem credible, I had to create one. So I actually created the acronym UWF, which stands for Underwear First, which is what I think families need in that situation. You can also call it brief therapy if you're in the mental health field. We need to deal with people's basic needs before they're able to acknowledge and address their other emotional needs. And these basic needs include safety, security, food, shelter, and communication and reunification with family and other significant caregivers and family members. The same is true for adults, and that includes professionals. Staff are going to have their own basic needs, and the crisis preparedness and response plans need to consider them a priority. Several months ago, I was speaking in near the Gulf Coast, and I was talking to a group of healthcare providers that were in a parish that had experienced flooding, which was unusual for that community. And over half of the community was actually submerged in water, and they were just recovering from that. And one of the physicians, after hearing my presentation, said, the first thing I did when we opened the shelter was to go out and spend several $100s just to buy underwear. And that's what people really needed. And then she started to tell me that there was one of the parents of a child with sickle cell disease who had a high fever, who had come in to see one of the physicians in that shelter. And the physician told the mother that she needed to go immediately to the emergency department because children with sickle cell disease don't have a strong immune system, and a high fever can quickly turn into, that can be the first sign of a serious and overwhelming infection that might even be deadly. And the mother said that she wasn't ready to go to the emergency department. And the physician said, well, you understand sickle cell disease. You know how serious it is. Why wouldn't you go? And the mother shared that it had been 2 or 3 days since the flooding had first occurred, and her child was still in the same clothes he was wearing from the day he evacuated. And he was incontinent, and he was too embarrassed to go to the hospital, so they were waiting in line first for underwear. So the underwear first is not just a joke. It actually is what people need. And I was also reminded when I was in New Orleans after Katrina, I think it was maybe 3 or 4 months afterwards, and someone told me a story about a preacher who was giving the sermon in church one day, and someone's cell phone went off in the audience in the middle of the sermon. And the audience made a lot of noise about how inappropriate that was. And the preacher just stopped the sermon and said, you know what? That might be your contractor. You better take that call. So what the preacher demonstrated was that he truly understood the needs of his congregation, and that literally the Word of God was not as important as making sure that you are safe and that those that you care about are safe. And the comment that the person made to me as he told the story was, this preacher really gets us. And that's what you want to do. You want to create an environment where people feel that their needs are respected and understood. So that's the first step, and that is an incredibly important step. And I would say for education support professionals, you're probably in the best position to provide that for a lot of children in these communities. And I will say that schools are the place where they will get a lot of those basic needs. I went to one community that had gone through the wildfires in the Great Smoky Mountains. And when I talked with them, they told me that they had a number of people who worked in, the hotel industry or were migrant farmers, and that area, and a lot of them were not were illegal immigrants. And they said that the only place they felt safe in getting their basic needs met was at the school. They weren't going to go to the shelters. They weren't going to go to distribution centers. They weren't going to go to food banks, but they would go to their school. And so the school took on the responsibility of distributing water and food and clothing because that was the one place where people felt safe that they could actually go for help. Now, for some individuals, though, the psychological first aid and basic services are not going to be sufficient. And so the second approach that we want to do at the same time is to identify what kids are going to need more services and refer them. But the reality is I'm going to go over some of the symptoms which are listed in this slide. But I do want to point out that probably the most common symptom doesn't appear on the slide because it's no symptoms at all. So while I'm going to go over potential symptoms, please realize that a lot of children will not show you any obvious symptoms of their distress. And what you may need to do is provide additional support and assistance just based on their exposure, their experience. But these symptoms can help. So the first one is sleep problems. That can be trouble falling asleep, trouble staying asleep, frequent wakenings, difficulty wakening in the morning, frequent nightmares. Really any disruption in sleep can occur as a result of trauma. And children who don't sleep well don't do well in school the next day and for days to come. So you want to sometimes give particular attention to making sure that they sleep well. That's one of the symptoms that sometimes we work specifically on. The next is separation anxiety and school avoidance. A lot of children who have gone through difficult or traumatic events may be afraid to separate from their parents and other family members for fear that something will happen to either their family members or to the child themselves if they're not together. And so I've been in communities that have had major natural disasters, and in one of the communities I went to, their population doubled within 1 week of all the displaced children from New Orleans. And they told me that 4 months after Katrina, the majority of children who had relocated to the community and registered for school had still not shown up for a day of school. So we really need to reach out to the children who don't come back to school, because those may be the children who are struggling the most. Now, children, as you can imagine, may develop fears, they may develop general anxiety, or they may have trauma-related fears. So, understandably, if they were involved in a tornado, they may be afraid of a storm in the future or other severe weather. But they may also just become more fearful. So you may see, for example, children who become more afraid of the dark, even though the disaster or crisis event happened during daylight. You can also see children develop irritability and difficulties with concentration as a result of the traumatic experience that they've been through, and as a result, they may also have deterioration in their academic performance. Children may also demonstrate what we call regression. They start to act like younger children. You see the thumb sucking occurring in children that didn't have that problem before, or kindergarten students who didn't have problems with separation now become more clingy and more resistant to being left by their parents. But they may also develop what we call social regression. They may become more demanding or more selfish, or have more difficulty getting along with peers or family members, or thinking about the needs of others. And we have to warn adults that this is often a sign that they're under stress and having difficulty coping. That selfishness isn't always that they're not impacted by it. It may actually be that they're very much impacted and they need some additional support. And I will say that we need to be prepared that adults may demonstrate the same social regression as well. So I see teachers yelling at students more after there have been school shootings. And we see adults also having less flexibility, being more likely to lose their temper. And I've even seen this among trauma mental health professionals after major crisis events. I remember talking to one parent after a major disaster in their community, and I asked them how old. I asked the different parents how old their children were. And one mother looked at me and she said, well, I have a number of children, but there are two of them that I'm most concerned about. One is 5 years old, and the other is 35 years old, and I'm more worried about the 35-year-old. And at that point, her husband, who was standing right next to her, picked up a toddler, and he started crying and left the room. And she started to tell me about how hard it was for him and what impact that was having on her children. So we need to recognize that you're going to see these problems in adults as well. To be quite honest, you're going to see them among professionals, and you may see it among your school administrators as well. We can also see sadness in children after something bad has happened, as you'd imagine, and they may actually develop symptoms of depression. And one of the ways they may show this is avoidance of previously enjoyed activities. So they may say they don't want to do things that they did before because it isn't fun, or it seems silly in light of everything that's gone on. But sometimes that's because they've become more mature, but it may also be simply that because they feel that they're depressed and they don't derive joy, or they're afraid to separate from their family to go out and do the things that they used to do with their peers. And so it's really important that we look at not only what they're doing, but why they're not doing it. So if children are engaging in other activities like volunteering to do service in their community or becoming more involved in faith-based organizations, then that may be maturity. But if they're simply doing nothing and staying home and afraid to leave, then that is something that needs to be of concern. You can also see substance use, either a new onset or an increase in cigarette smoking, alcohol use, or other substance use. And that's something that we see not only in children, but we see in adults as well. They may also develop what we call somatization, which just means that they develop physical complaints even though their distress is psychological or emotional in nature. And so we spend a lot of time working with school nurses to help them with that, because a lot of the children end up presenting because of their physical complaints. Children may also show symptoms consistent with the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. I'd be happy if there are questions going over that. But the point I would like to make is there probably are a wider range of reactions and concerns that are seen after crisis events, well beyond the post-traumatic symptoms and disorders. For those children whose family member or friend died as a result of the crisis, bereavement may be their predominant problem. And I talked about that in the last webinar. And often we assume that everything that occurs after a disaster or a crisis is post-traumatic, when in fact it may actually be loss that's their issue. So if we think about, for example, some of the flooding that's going on in these communities, there's a lot that we can anticipate. For one thing, they may be grieving the death of someone that occurred during the event. But they also experience a large number of what we call secondary losses and stressors. So it isn't just that they deal with the event that happened. They deal with everything that follows as a result. So a lot of these children will have forced relocation, and they'll lose their peer network. They will have to move from their home, or they may actually lose their home and all their belongings. And when they move to their new schools, even temporarily, they often suffer academic failure. It's different coursework, they're under stress, they're living in less than ideal conditions in many situations. And they have to integrate into a new social network. And a lot of times those networks are not welcoming. Children may not want to have a lot of other students in their school. There's also financial stresses that happen in families. Parents are either unemployed or underemployed after these disasters, and that leads to parental stress and parental mental health problems, which in turn can lead to marital conflict or even domestic violence. The issue is that you're not just dealing with the event. You deal with all these things that follow. So if a student comes up to you and he's distressed because he's been up all night, because his parents were arguing, and the arguing was about financial needs because the mother is unemployed because her business or her place of business was destroyed by the floods. If you talk to the child about the trauma of the actual day of the flooding, you might miss the point, because the issue may be that they're really struggling with what's happened since. And we need to focus our attention on how are kids currently doing and what are the challenges they're now facing. Some of those may be persistent trauma symptoms, but often there are actually reactions to things that followed the traumatic event. I remember talking to a number of different parents and school professionals and having them talk about all the things that have happened since the event occurred. I've even seen this with school shootings. In one school that I went to, the superintendent looked at me and said, well, do you ever find that enrollment drops after a major school shooting? And I just looked at her and I said, are you asking me whether parents are reluctant to send their children to a school where a child brought in an assault weapon and murdered other students? And she just looks at me and she goes, I guess the answer is yes. And I said, yes. And then what happens then is that the enrollment drops. And when the enrollment drops, the budget of the school is based on the income that comes in, which is per student that attends. So often they end up with financial problems. And when they have financial problems, often the school administration then has to turn to cost-cutting measures at a time when they have dramatic need for support. And they often can't cut the educational staff or wouldn't want to, so they end up cutting the support staff that they really need to provide the support to students. And that can cause, as you would imagine, not only the distress to the staff, but also the distress to the students. We also have to remember that one crisis often awakens feelings related to pre-existing or past crises that may be related or even unrelated to the event. I went into one school that had a school shooting and a student that died, and I was talking about this phenomenon that this happens, and one of the teachers became very upset. I didn't see it during the session, but I heard she was crying most of her way home, and she came in early the next day and wanted to speak with me. And what she told me was that when I mentioned this, it finally made sense to her. The shooting that had occurred, that one of the children who was seriously injured ended up dying a couple days later. And she said, and that coincided with the 20-year anniversary of when her brother had been murdered. She didn't make the connection right away. She said she couldn't understand why she was so upset and why it was persistent for so many days. She didn't know the student who had died. She hadn't met him before. And quite honestly, I believe she wasn't in school on the day of the shooting. She didn't understand why she was so impacted. And once she figured out that it just reminded her of the death of her brother, then she said she felt like she understood her feelings and also felt like she could manage them. So you have to realize that it's not just the event, it's everything that follows, and unfortunately it's everything that precedes as well. And that's why it can be so difficult for these communities to recover. So what would you expect in schools then, particularly if you don't intervene and provide support? Well, one thing you see an increase in absenteeism, as I mentioned, from the school avoidance. The kids don't come in, or many of them don't come in. Those that do come in, often you'll see an increase in suspensions and expulsions. It's because of the irritability, the social regression, or the substance use, or any of the other reactions that you'll see. So the kids may come in and then get sent home. And then for those that remain, you may see a drop in cognitive functioning and academic achievement due to anxiety, trouble concentrating, sleep problems, sadness, or depression. So either the kids don't come in, they come in and they get sent home, or they stay there and they may have trouble learning. There's a whole range of different problems that you may see, but they all lead to one thing, which is a drop in graduation rate. So when school administrators tell me, we understand that these things are difficult, and I'm talking not just about major events, but also personal events in the lives of children and their families. They'll say, well, we understand that may be a problem, but it's not really what we do, and that we're really here to provide education and to do the work of helping kids learn. So I just tell them, well, taking time in schools to help children adjust to personal, family, and major crisis and loss is essential to promote academic achievement. So even if that's all you're worried about, and I would hope that wouldn't be the case in school, but even if it is, it still requires that you pay attention to this, because otherwise you're not going to promote learning in the students either. Now, this was one of the posters that Project Liberty put up after, about 6 months after 9/11. They all had the same tagline, if only the signs were this easy to read. You would think, with all of the symptoms that I told you about, that we would recognize that kids are suffering and that they're struggling, and we would provide them support. But actually, the opposite is true. Parents and other adults that support children tend to underestimate the extent of children's reactions to a crisis situation, especially when it's related to how they're feeling internally, because you can't see it. And there's a number of reasons why this occurs. One is that children may attempt to withhold their complaints of these symptoms, simply because of concerns that it makes them feel that they're abnormal, or there's just somehow it's just inappropriate to have those feelings, or because they wish to protect their parents or other adults around them who are visibly upset. But the parents may also be aware of the symptoms, but still fail to report them, because they don't think professionals are interested in hearing about them. There's a common phrasing or explanation that I hear given after major disasters. And they often will say, well, everything's normal. All of your feelings are normal after a disaster. Well, that's not the case, because a lot of people are, have normal feelings and concerns and thoughts before a crisis, and it doesn't get better just because there's been a crisis situation. The other thing I hear is it's just a normal reaction to an abnormal event. And while I understand the reason for that expression, I think it really just gets heard by people as everyone else is dealing with this, so just suck it up and deal with it. It doesn't really encourage people to seek or to accept support. So what I tell individuals is, instead of saying it's just a normal reaction to an abnormal event and then asking them, do you feel you need counseling? What I would say instead is that even psychologically healthy people, such as you, when they find themselves in situations such as this, may still benefit from getting some support for the distress they may feel. And then I ask their permission, can we get someone to talk with you to help you deal with this? I think people are more likely to say yes if it's phrased that way than to say, is it just a normal reaction to an abnormal event? Do you think you need help? I think when we say that, it just makes it unlikely that they're going to accept our assistance. We need to realize that there's so much stigma related to mental illness, and it doesn't go away after a disaster, or even if that emotional distress is caused by the disaster. We still need to work to make sure that we encourage people to accept the assistance. I remember being in clinic once several years ago, and there was a 6-year-old girl who came in. She'd been attacked by a pit bull about a week prior. She had a very deep wound on her leg and had gone to the emergency room and got sutured in the emergency room. She was asked to come back to clinic a week later just to check the wound, and that was the visit that she was at. Pediatrician who was initially seeing her went in, came back, and told me that, what he had seen, and he said, the wound looks okay to me, but it's such an extensive and deep wound, I really would like you to come and take a look. So before I went in, I said, how's she doing otherwise? And this was a pediatric resident who was in training, and he looked at me because he knew me, and he said, I asked the mother how the girl's doing emotionally, and she said that the girl was doing well. And I paused, and he goes, and you taught us that the mothers don't often, and fathers don't often know. You need to ask the child directly. So I asked the girl directly, and she said she was doing fine. So I went in and I saw the wound, and it looked fine, and I asked the girl how she was doing. She was smiling. Her mother was smiling. I asked first the mother, how's your daughter doing? It must be difficult what she's been through. And the mother said she's doing fine. But the doctor before her asked, thanks for your concern, but she's okay. And then I turned to the girl and I said, dear, this must be really hard for you. How are you doing? And she smiled and she said, I'm doing fine, but thank you for asking. So there wasn't really any indication that there was any problem by my questions or the residents' questions. But then as I was leaving, I just turned to the mom and I asked her, how's she doing in school? And the mother just said, I don't know. And I said, why don't you know? And she goes, well, she hasn't gone back to school for the last week. She's afraid to leave the house. So I said, well, how's she sleeping? And she said, oh, she doesn't sleep at night. She has nightmares every night. She wakes up screaming about dogs attacking her. I said, well, does she startle easily? She said, oh, yes. If the door closes or slams closed or there's any noise, she gets startled and thinks that she's being attacked by a dog. So we went over that those are the concerns we were seeking. That's why we asked how she was doing, and that we do care about that, and we are here to help with that, and we don't just look at wounds. And so, we gave her information about how to support her child and asked her to come back in a week to just show us how she was doing emotionally and to call us, during the week if she was continuing to have problems or had any other difficulties. And as I was in, both the girl and the mother said they were very grateful for that. And I just turned to the mom before I left and I said, can you just help me understand this better? 2 doctors asked you and your daughter how she was doing, and you said fine, but it doesn't sound like it's fine. Can you ask me why you said that? And she just looked at me and she said, oh, that's easy, because if you were attacked by the dog, you'd do exactly the same thing. So the point is, we tend to try and figure out what's normal and abnormal, but if people are in distress and we can provide support for it, we should just do that. We shouldn't be trying to judge whether it's normal or abnormal. Instead, we need to figure out, is there a way we can help you with what's bothering you? And if so, then let's go ahead and do that. Next thing I want to talk about was really the timeline before I go for coping, before I just end by talking about professional self-care. And if you imagine that this is a graph of coping over time, we each have a baseline from A to B, which shows us how we're coping at a particular point in time. And there are days where things are going well, or portions of days where we're happy and something good happens. And then there's days where we find out that someone is sick, or that we are ill, or we have financial concerns, and we aren't coping as well. But we go back to our baseline without outside help. So just because you see people in distress does not mean they're in crisis. Crisis event is not actually defined by the event itself. It's defined by whether the person is able to cope with the event without external support. That's what resilience is all about. If we build their capacity to deal themselves with adversity, then they become more resilient. So it's not a straight line. But for anyone, there may be an event that exceeds their capacity to respond to it and to cope with it without external support. And so then what happens is they become vulnerable, and at point D, their usual coping mechanisms have failed, and they are in crisis. And at that point, there's a tendency for communities to come together, for neighbors, for people who never knew each other, to offer support and assistance. It's a time where we bake food in casserole format. We wear ribbons and put ribbons on vertical things to let them know that we care about what's happened. And we look out for each other in ways that we haven't done before. And what happens is people start to do better. But unfortunately, just because people are doing better does not mean they are all better. And there's a tendency for once we see some improvement, particularly in children, to just presume that they will continue to improve without any additional support. That somehow the resiliency that's inherent in children will just take over as soon as they start to get better. But actually what happens is for individuals who start to improve, some may feel that they're not going to make it back to their baseline. And that's where helplessness and hopelessness can set in. And sometimes we see several months afterwards, after major national disasters, that individuals may actually increase the rates of suicide in some communities. Say about 3 or 4 months after Katrina, in the New Orleans area, when I was visiting, healthcare providers could list the names of people they knew who had killed themselves. And there was a supplement to Pediatrics, a medical journal from the American Academy of Pediatrics, that was dedicated to a young pediatrician who killed himself after Katrina in New Orleans. So we want to make sure that just because people are doing better, that we don't withdraw our support. We need to continue to provide the support, because if we withdraw it too soon, most children will not harm themselves physically. They may just not return to their baseline in terms of coping. And that's what I just called here, that they establish a new baseline, which is continued impairment. What we need to do is to continue that support until children and adults at least reach their baseline level of coping. And if they have enough internal resiliency and enough external support, they may actually exceed their baseline, and this is what we refer to as post-traumatic growth. Children are changed forever by these events. These are life-changing events, but it doesn't mean they're damaged forever. It just means they're different. And sometimes that difference is post-traumatic growth. They may have a new sense of what's important in life, more of a desire to help others than to worry about accumulating wealth. They may have a new sense of spirituality, become more empathic, or they may have more tools to cope with adversity, and they will get adversity in the future, and they may be even better prepared to be able to deal with it. What I would say is my experience for a lot of education support professionals is that they've gone into their work because they recognize that it is important to help children and support children. And for many, it is because they experienced a loss or a crisis or a challenge in their own childhood, and they appreciated the help that someone gave them, or they recognized how important it would have been for someone to have given them that help. And they have experienced post-traumatic growth as a result. The problem with post-traumatic growth is that exactly what makes you go into the field to help others and to realize how important that is may place you at more risk of having those feelings uncovered when you're helping others. So exactly what puts people in the position of wanting to provide support to others, they make them vulnerable to experience distress when they do that. And that's the last point I wanted to make, is to recognize the importance of self-care. It's distressing to be with children who are in distress. And it's really critical that staff find ways to have their own personal needs met and appreciate and address the impact of supporting children who are grieving or traumatized. So in closing, I'm just going to mention a couple resources. I've already, hopefully, you're familiar with the work of the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement. We want to promote the appreciation of the role schools can serve to support students, staff, and families at times of both crisis and loss, to enhance training for different groups in this area, and to serve as a resource for information, training materials, consultation, and technical assistance. I refer you to the website of the center, which is just schoolcrisiscenter.org. This is just a picture of what the landing page is. You can go to I Need Help Now to get a number of different resources for immediate help, or Help Me Prepare, which has more educational material. And as I mentioned in the last webinar on bereavement, there are also materials at grievingstudents.org. This is a booklet, for example, on how to support children who are grieving the death of a loved one in their family. And as I mentioned in the last webinar, the Coalition to Support Grieving Students was formed from 10 of the major school professional organizations, including the National Education Association, to really develop materials that can be used to support grieving children. And that's web-based materials, which I'll go into. In addition to the 10 founding members, we now have over 20 supporting organizational members, including, for example, the American School Health Association and the American Academy of Pediatrics. These are some of the other supporting organizational members, and the list is growing. And you can find those resources at grievingstudents.org. We have over 20 video-based modules that have material as well as print material. The last slide is just summarizes some of those resources. We have a toll-free number for schools to contact us if we can provide assistance, and the two websites are repeated here. And the last thing I'll say is just go to Facebook and like the center and the coalition, and help us with spreading the word about these resources. So I'm going to stop here and open it to questions for the remaining of our time.
Thank you, Dr. Sean Feld, for that informative presentation on how the role ESPs can play in supporting students in a time of crisis. We can see from your presentation this evening how important it is for the whole school and community to work together to support students. So as we open up this section, this Q&A section, as I stated in the chat area, please begin typing any questions that you have for Dr. Schonfeld, and we will capture them as we go. Up to this point, all questions have been answered, so we will just, I see some people are typing, so we will wait to see what questions come in, and we'll take them one by one. Dr. Schonfeld, just a question for you as we're waiting. Is there any, I know that we've had in the U.S. and both abroad many instances, these hurricanes that are hitting back to back, and we have students who are not only being displaced but also have families that are being impacted. Dr. Schonfeld, just a question for you as we're waiting. Is there any, I know that we've had in the U.S. and both abroad many instances, these hurricanes that are hitting back to back, and we have students who are not only being displaced but also have families that are being impacted, you know, abroad, that may cause concern. The way that we interact with the students and the way that we offer support for those who may be experiencing some kind of anxiety because of the unknown. Is there anything that you can offer? Will we treat those situations any differently from the information that you have provided this evening? Is there anything that some of our ESPs would need to keep in mind when dealing with those type of situations?
Yeah. The material that I presented is relevant to that situation. The principles of psychological first aid and basic support is really what you want to provide. But I think you want to enter in assuming that children may be impacted even if there's no, you don't think that they would be and don't have any direct connection. I remember when I was living in Cincinnati, it was about 5 years after 9/11, and one of the museums was going to open an exhibit. It was a museum that was about a different topic area. It wasn't about crisis or disasters, but they had a visiting exhibit that related to the impact of 9/11. And I was meeting with the leadership of the museum, and when I was talking with them, they said, well, you know, what do we have to worry about? And I went over what they should be thinking about, because these kids were going to arrive at the school, and they weren't going to arrive, I mean, at the exhibit, and they weren't going to have even known what it was about. And they just kind of said to me, well, you know, we're in Cincinnati. We're nowhere near where it happened in Washington or in New York City. And I just looked at them and I said, yeah, but they have family members. They have people they know that were impacted by this. I said, my daughter went to a school and her friend's mother worked in the World Trade Center. She could be showing up at this exhibit. You need to presume that everyone might be impacted. It's just respectful to people because you don't really know their connection. And there's also the phenomenon that even if they weren't impacted directly and no one they know was impacted, they can still be upset. Because when you hear about terrorism and disasters and crisis events and shootings that happen to other people, you start to realize there's a lot of bad stuff that could happen, and that means it could happen to you. And that's, we call it the kind of the threat to the assumptive world of a child. They usually, people assume that they're safe and that if they get into a car that, you know, they'll get out of the car safely. There's just certain assumptions that people make. And when you find out that that assumption is exactly that, it's an assumption, and that it didn't work for someone else, then you realize that all the assumptions you made may not come true for you either, or for those that you care about, and that makes people feel very vulnerable. And that's part of the reason why they become so intent in finding out everything about it, because they want to, at some level, be able to reassure themselves that they know how to make sure this isn't going to happen to them or someone they care about. But the reality is there's not really much you can do to prevent a lot of these things from happening. And as a result, it just leaves people who are not directly impacted still feeling vulnerable and upset. So I would just, we have material on our website, for example, on how to talk to children about acts of terrorism or school shootings that they hear about in the news, because we really want to be sensitive to the fact that for individuals who aren't in the direct line of injury and weren't in those communities, they still can be impacted.
Okay. We have a question from Jenny McGee. She states that she has 2 students who are siblings whose house was hit by a car, and then 4 months later they lost their grandfather, and due to these events they are no longer on her bus. And she wants to know whether there's a way for her to help them since she doesn't see them anymore.
Okay. So if they are still in the community, or there's a way to reach out to them, even through, you know, Facebook or other social media, if, you know, a staff person wishes, and I don't think they should feel obligated to, but if they wish to convey their support and say that they're still thinking of them and care about them, even just getting them that message can mean a whole lot. For children who feel isolated and alone and away from all of the supports, knowing that there's someone who cares about you, who you're connected with, can be very helpful. And so that's one thing that you can do. And whether that's, again, through social media, through writing a letter, through giving a message to the school to be communicated, I think that can be very useful. Sometimes you don't have a way to connect with them, but you can still focus on all the other children and families and other adults who are experiencing some of those same feelings of loss, you know, or worries about the individual who went through that experience. So you can try and offer some support and assistance to the family that was directly impacted, but you can also provide assistance to everyone who's still on the bus and maybe is worried about the kids that are no longer there.
Okay. We also have a question from Yvonne Mounts, and she said she wants to know how education support professionals can help students that want to help and support their peers.
All right. Well, a lot of times kids will tell me that they don't provide help or reach out because they don't know what to say or how to say it. And so you can help them figure out what could they do to both see what the child might want as assistance or to offer assistance. So sometimes, kids may come back and they've, let's say, been injured and their parent died in the accident, and the kids don't know what to do. Well, there's some concrete things that you can do. You can offer to carry their books. You can ask them if they want the notes from your class that you missed. You can offer to sit with them. You can express your concern. You can say, I heard about what happened, and I'm so sorry. Please let me know if there's some way that I can help. If you help children by modeling some of the language and helping them think through ways to be of assistance, then they can often be of great assistance and can be very helpful. If you don't, then children often either don't, they can isolate the child who's returning, or sometimes they even tease them because they want to, that's sometimes the way they get more information. Because they may not say, I understand that your mother was killed in a car accident. I always wondered what it would be like to have a mother die. Could you share that experience with me? Instead, particularly younger children will just say, your mommy's dead. And they don't know how to ask the question. So if you provide information to the peers and answer their questions, then they may also be in a better position to help the child who's experienced the crisis or loss.
Okay, I think we have a question coming in from Cynthia Dickerson. I see she's typing, so let's just hold off one more second. If anybody else has any questions, we'll be answering just a couple more before we move on. Okay, she said that she has a child that misses his father, met him only once or twice, and never quite thought about him as grieving his father until now. How can she help him? Because he gets sad very quickly.
So this is an excellent point. When a lot of what I talked about on the last webinar was grieving the death of someone, and this time I've been talking about dealing with crisis events. We also have situations where people may be missing a parent, but not through death. It could be from deployment. It could be from incarceration. It could be that they don't know their parent or their parent is separated from the parent they're living with. Those children also experience grief and are sensitized to the loss as well. And a lot of these same strategies can be used with them, just acknowledging that that may be difficult and also recognizing situations that might trigger some of those feelings. So, for example, at Father's Day, on Father's Day when they do art activities, let's say, of, draw a card for your father. For kids whose parents are dead, that can be very stressful because they don't know what to do and don't know that they can do it now that their parent is dead. But it can also be for children whose parent is alive but not living with them. So when we ask people to introduce, when we go over with teachers, how do you introduce this activity, you could say for those children who don't have a parent who's currently alive, or in this case a father who's currently alive, or currently living with you, you can still do this exercise. You can think about what role they have played for you in the past and do it in their memory, or you may pick another male adult in your life that's been a help to you and do the activity thinking about them. So we need to recognize that just because a parent is alive doesn't mean that they are not missed very much. I recently had one parent get in touch with me that her husband had a massive stroke, and he didn't die, but he really wasn't accessible anymore to the children, and that was in some ways even more difficult because they couldn't understand, what relationship they could still have with their dad, but they also missed the relationship they had had before. So we should think about the range of loss experiences that children have, and it isn't just bereavement, and it isn't just after major crisis events.
Thank you for that response. At this time, I would like to once again thank Dr. Sean Feld for his informative webinar session this evening. On behalf of the Center of Great Public Schools, NEA ESP Quality Department, I would like to thank everyone for taking the time to participate in this evening's session. We look forward to your participation in future webinars. Please be sure to visit www.nea.org/ESPPD to stay up to date with both recorded and upcoming webinar sessions. Thank you and have a good evening.